Hello everyone, this is Lucian Vulsan with the Freedom Alternative. I'm in front of the Romanian government in downtown Bucharest in the first day in which officially there is no longer any state of emergency due to the Wuhan Flu. But at the same time, the so-called National Liberal Party, more likely the National Socialist quasi-liberal party, has decided to illegally institute a so-called alert state in which they pretend that they can issue sanctions, but in reality they can't. I have tried myself to get myself sanctioned for not wearing a mask, have failed to do so because they all know that it's all a sham. So as a result, a lot of civic movements, whatever, they have called in a protest here in Victoria Square in front of the Romanian government. So far, we're about 1 hour before the official hour when they were supposed to start. There's already about 30 or 40 people, maybe 50 if you count those in that direction. And yeah, we're just waiting to see what happens. And we'll be staying here to report. And hopefully something very nice will come out. Let's explore. Romania was in mid-May one of the few countries in the world to have followed the insanity promoted by the violent communist from the China Health Organization in relation to the Wuhan flu, yet the government experiencing no visible blowback from that. Well, May the 15th came and the visible blowback with it too. The blowback came in two ways, in the parks and in the usual spots for protests. And the cathedral media, recently paid for by the government to keep up with the Wuhan flu panic card agitprop, was furious at both of these events. During daytime, they would harass the protesters and trying to spin as much bullshit as possible against the protesters, and during the night time they would follow the youngsters in the parks and snitch them in their papers, TV stations and websites for breaching the holy nonsense of social distancing. But this is still Romania, which means you can rely on certain things happening no matter what. One of them being that while most people don't vocally protest, at least not yet, most people will outright ignore anything both the government and the media has to say. You can also rely on government incompetence, especially with the current ruling party. You can rely on loons showing up at protests, like they do at literally any protest, and in the case of Bucharest in mid-May, you can rely on very decent weather. And all of these factors came into force at once. The government, in its almighty wisdom, outright forgot that they simply cannot extend the so-called state of emergency beyond 60 consecutive days. And since the ruling party already lost at least 17 percentage points just in the last 3 months alone, the idea of trying to prolong it was in itself unfeasible politically, even if it were possible legally, given the election time is coming in less than 7 months. But more on that in another video closer to that election. So, about a week before the end of the state of emergency, multiple groups, including our network, started agitating for protests because we calculated, as it turns out correctly, that the government cannot legally do anything to stop them starting from May the 15th, no matter how much they tried. The calculation was that if the police will get violent, like they did in August 2018, That's not so bad because such events routinely end up with the collapse of the government, which in itself would be a good thing as the so-called National Liberal Party has proven itself to be a criminal organization whose curve of existence should be flattened for sanitary reasons. If, however, the police would not turn violent, then this would be a good opportunity to count our dictators, the paid shills, the provocateurs, and of course get to meet new people and fellow travelers and maybe make some new friends. Well, we didn't get any new friends, but got a bit of all the others during the 3 days of protests in Victoria Square. Why 3 days? Because the government couldn't get new regulations in place and abide the constitution at the same time. So they opted for patchwork legislation rushed through the parliament, which came into force on May the 18th. That one, the State of Alert Act, sort of bans protests-ish, but between May the 15th and May the 18th, well, nothing from a legal perspective. So the idiots in charge resorted to outright lying about the law, giving more money to the cathedral media, so they also lie and try to scare the normies and, perhaps the funniest of all, the heads of the police, Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Gendarmerie engaged in the cringiest example of doublethink since the early 1990s. On TV, they would insist that all protests are banned under punishment of heavy fines, but in the field, they would engage in jokes with the protesters and the press, knowing full well that, legally speaking, merely touching any of us would have been a legal shitstorm which the police could not win, neither legally nor from a propaganda perspective.
Aceeași mizerie, PNL și PSD, aceeași mizerie, PNL și PSD, aceeași mizerie. Toate partidele au votat aceste măsuri pandemice, aceste măsuri draconice care vor duce la distrugerea economiei, care vor aduce foamete în această țară. Toate partidele ne-au sequestrat, toate partidele ne-au ținut în casă.
Deci vrem să stricăm.
Toate partidele au semnat arestul domiciliar. Toate partidele, aceeași mizerie. 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 Toate partidele, aceeași mizerie.
So thus the protests began on Friday, and in parallel, those who couldn't join us helped with the propaganda war. The protests themselves weren't important. This is something everyone in the field knew all too well. The propaganda about them was important. So at first, the cathedral media claimed that we're all spreading the Wuhan flu in downtown Bucharest by doing group hugs. As you can all see in the footage from day one, this was so far away from reality that even the paid shills dropped this attack line in under 1 hour. Then the media focused on the loons, all 3 of them, out of an over 500 people gathering. That worked for a while until even some of those who buy into the propaganda started asking, hold on a second, if it's a gathering of anti-vaxxers and conspiracists and loons and so on and so forth, why are we seeing the same 3 people interviewed? Aren't they like hundreds? And that was the problem, because the claims in the gathering, while indeed not unified, given that many small groups, including left-wing groups, attended, the claims were quite diverse. Yes, from ridiculous conspiracies to dubious geopolitical claims, but also to claims about the supremacy of the Constitution, which this government has violated several times and is now being sued by thousands of individuals. Claims about policy, especially the policy of forcibly putting asymptomatic cases of the Chinese virus straight into the hospital, a practice that almost everyone else on the planet abandoned months ago. Claims about patients that are not being treated due to the exaggerated focus on the commie cough, and even syndicalist claims. Oh, and even claims rooted in the US tradition of individual liberty. Ouch. That's a problem. So the cathedral media got a hint from their German friends and came up with the usual trick. Everyone in the Victoria Square is paid for by the Russians. The evidence? Well, just like with the loons, a resounding number of 3, there were also 3 or 4 individuals who are known to be or have been or having been connected in the past with Russia.
Parlament penal! Marș la canal! Parlament penal! Marș la canal! Parlament penal! Marș la canal! Parlament penal! Marș la canal!
Ultimately, for the cathedral media, this trick doesn't really work in this country, for the simple reason that this is a country where disdain for Russia is so widespread that it simply isn't an allegation that just sticks. You kinda need evidence, more than just 3 people. Maybe these were paid for by Putin too? Or perhaps this fella? But just to make that clear, in the second day, the protesters brought further clarification. By Saturday evening, the memed image of these fine gentlemen was getting a bigger audience than almost all of the cathedral media combined. The meme reads, "If these are the pro-Russians, then you are the stupid." Ouch. But the aspects that the cathedral didn't show are the aspects that mattered, of course. For instance, the police expected no more than 20 people to show up in the first day and less than 10 in the second day. In reality, 500-ish showed up in the first day and 400-ish in the second day at the peak, with the second day being a lot better organized and fit for purpose than the first day. The purpose being, of course, the propaganda dispute. And that's what's really pissing off the establishment and the liberal shills. The fact that almost all of the peeps that attended are fully aware of the methods, the legal tools, and the steps necessary to implement an agitprop operation. The liberal shills are aware that if implemented correctly, by the election time, the National Liberal Party not only won't be part of the governing coalition, but may as well risk staying out of the next parliament. Of course, none of them will admit any of that in public. So they just double down. In many ways, kinda like the Democrats in the United States who know they'll be in serious trouble come November, but they have to keep up with the charade, hoping to at least eke some votes from the new converts to the religion of lockdownism. Besides the political interest, there is the financial interest, and not just in Romania, but almost everywhere else too. In the case of my country, at least $10 billion have vanished into all sorts of highly dubious expenses, such as ungodly salaries for the so-called hero doctors, who for the most part slept through the so-called pandemic as most hospitals stood empty for over 2 months, various military-style hospitals who treated exactly 0 people, various so-called protective equipment which protected exactly nobody, and so on and so forth. Suffice to say that the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, the institution lauded by the New York Times, will have a lot of work in the next few years. Ultimately, this will be a propaganda dispute for the next 6 to 7 months. As explained a few weeks ago, politics always wins. The Wuhan Flu is not even a flu, it's just a cough, as more and more data comes in and becomes clear that essentially all of the policies adopted allegedly to curb this allegedly dangerous cough were not just useless, but have done a lot more harm in a few months than this cough could have done in several decades, assuming it lives that long. But proving that is not enough, because the truth is not relevant. What's relevant is winning the politics of the Chinese cough. And winning the politics of it requires action. Protests are just a tiny portion of that. A lot more important will be the lawfare, the propaganda dispute, the naming and shaming of all of these so-called experts who were consistently wrong in ways that very few people imagined they could be, and yes, the personal punishment of all those who knew better but chose to shill in the wrong direction for personal interests. You know who they are in your countries. Keep those lists. You will badly need them.
Spune
Over the next few months, everyone interested in doing justice to this topic and winning the politics of the commie cough should be very busy with discrediting every single media institution that pushed for the extremist policies, discrediting every single expert that shilled for this, discrediting every single politician who shilled for this, and of course, never let any professional shill sleep well. Wherever you see them and you have an audience, make sure you let the audience know that this person is a shill. Forever and ever till the end of time. Because if you don't, they win. As we always say here, entropy is on the side of the totalitarians. Light is on the side of liberty. So drag them kicking and screaming, metaphorically speaking, straight into the sunlight, for sunlight is the best disinfectant, both metaphorically and literally, since sunlight is in itself of great help in curing any respiratory disease, including the Chinese cough. We will do our part here, but our friends in other countries should do theirs too. File lawsuits, spread the counter-narrative, do door-to-door activism, meet and greet the entrepreneurs heavily affected by this, convince them to vote in a different direction, and yes, fund more institutions that lean in our direction. The Wuhan Flu panic created a lot of desperate people who are ripe for priming and seeding liberty-oriented ideas. Not taking advantage of this would be a grave mistake. And one has to do it now for one simple reason. Every traumatic experience, and make no mistake, in most places the lockdown-style policies are or have been a traumatic experience for most people. In these collective traumas, the reaction within a year or two after the trauma ends is to try really, really hard to forget. The time for stirring the pot, if you want, is now and in the next several months. By July 2021, nobody will care and almost everyone will have forgotten. But in the next several months, there is a lot of energy that can be catalyzed not just for short-term gains, but also for cementing much more enduring structures or institutions. And the need for institutions is highly acute at this point, because another huge group of institutions got discredited with the occasion of the Wuhan Flu. Thus, the need for new institutions shall emerge. More people of our persuasions should be there to fulfill that need. The long march through institutions won't march itself. Someone has to walk the walk. Make sure it's as many of us as possible. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. As part of the effort on the current issue, send me to Sweden so I can document more about how this issue was understood better by commoners, and yet at leadership levels only Sweden and Belarus got it somewhat right. Departure to Sweden is quite soon, so yeah. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.